Welcome to Silent Queen's Calling. I'm so glad you're here. Now let's get into the story. She was 7 months pregnant, standing in the lobby of her husband's firm's annual gala, when his mother leaned in close and said, quietly enough that no one else could hear, that it might be better if Ren sat this one out. Not a suggestion, not a question, a dismissal, wrapped in linen and delivered with the smile of a woman who had never once doubted her right to rearrange other people's lives. Behind her mother-in-law, Ren could see her husband, Philip, laughing at something a colleague had said. His hand was on the small of another woman's back, not his wife's, not the back of the woman carrying his child. The woman in the pewter dress who had been introduced to Ren 6 months earlier as a new account director and who had, in those 6 months, accumulated a familiarity with Philip that no account director required. Ren Ashford did not make a scene. She set down her champagne glass, which contained sparkling water because she was 7 months pregnant, and had not touched alcohol since the morning she read the positive test in the bathroom of her own apartment, while Philip slept in the next room. She picked up her clutch. She walked to the coat check. She retrieved her coat. She walked out through the revolving doors into the November air, and she stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Not because she was devastated. She had already processed the devastation. She had processed it over 4 weeks in private, with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who had been trained since childhood to do the difficult thing correctly and not to mistake motion for progress. What she was doing standing on that sidewalk was deciding. She reached into her clutch and touched a small key on a brass ring. It opened a safety deposit box at a private bank on the other side of the city. Inside the box was a single document. She had drafted it 3 weeks ago. She had not yet signed it. She was going to sign it tonight. Part 1. The woman behind the key. Her name was Ren Ashford. To Philip, to his mother Claudette, to the 40 or so people at the gala who recognized her face without knowing her history, she was simply Ren, the quiet one. The architect who worked long hours and came home and cooked and managed everything and never complained about any of it, because complaining required a level of investment in the outcome that Ren had learned very early was a luxury not everyone could afford. What none of them knew was that Ren Ashford had been born Ren Lacey Forsham, the only child of Gordon Forsham, founder of Forsham Capital Partners, a private investment firm that had, over 37 years, built a portfolio spanning commercial infrastructure, biomedical technology, logistics networks, and a real estate division that owned stakes in 11 mixed-use developments across 8 states. The firm was private and intended to stay that way. Gordon Forsham had built it without a single press release and maintained it the same way, through quiet relationships, long patience, and an almost religious aversion to visibility. Ren had grown up inside that world the way you grow up inside. Any world that surrounds you completely. It was not glamorous. It was structured. Her father's office had worn carpeting and a coffee maker that had needed replacing since 2009, and he never replaced it because the coffee maker worked, and replacing things that worked was a waste of attention that could go elsewhere. She attended a good school on her own merits, studied architecture because buildings were the only thing she loved as much as she loved precision, and graduated with a thesis on adaptive reuse that her professor described as the most practically minded graduate project she had reviewed in a decade. She moved to a mid-sized city where nobody knew the Forsham name because the Forsham family did not put their name on buildings. They financed the people who put their names on buildings, and they found that arrangement considerably more advantageous. Ren rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a building with good bones and terrible fixtures, and she spent 3 weekends restoring it herself. She drove a 7-year-old Volvo. She wore linen and wool and one piece of jewelry at all times, a narrow gold band on her right hand that had belonged to her mother, engraved on the inside with a single word her mother had chosen. The year she married Gordon Forsham, the word was remain. Her mother had died when Ren was 14. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Ren had been present for the last week, and she had sat beside the bed and watched her mother's breathing change, and had understood, in the way that proximity to real things teaches you to understand real things, that the most important thing a person could do was be present for what mattered, and ruthlessly unavailable for what did not. She became an architect, specifically a restoration architect, the kind who spent months inside buildings that other people had given up on, finding what was worth preserving and building around it rather than tearing it down. Her firm, Ashford Studio, operated with 4 full-time staff and a reputation among preservation boards and private developers alike for delivering work that was structurally sound and aesthetically defensible, and never, under any circumstances, late. Her father supported her independence with complete seriousness. He had one standing instruction: never shrink to fit someone else's idea of who you should be. If someone cannot see you clearly, that is their limitation, not yours. Give them the opportunity to correct it. If they don't, remove yourself from the experiment. Wren had been removing herself from the experiment for the past 3 months. She just hadn't told anyone yet. Part 2. The Husband. Philip Ashford was a partner at a commercial development firm. He was handsome in the way of men who have always been told they are handsome, which is to say that his confidence ran slightly ahead of his competence in most rooms, and he had never once noticed the gap. He made good money. He believed he deserved more. He spoke about his projects the way coaches speak about games, with a proprietary energy that assumed your interest and did not wait to confirm it. Wren met him at a professional conference. He was presenting a panel on adaptive reuse financing. He cited her firm's work on the Caldwell Warehouse project without knowing she was in the room. When she introduced herself afterward, he laughed, a genuine startled laugh, and said, "That's your project? It's the best thing in this city by a considerable distance." She ran her 90-second assessment, the one she had been running since college, since the first time someone's behavior toward her shifted the moment they learned whose daughter she was. The assessment was simple. Was this person interested in her or in what she represented? Was the attention a reflex or a choice? Philip passed. He did not know about Forsham Capital. He knew about the Caldwell Warehouse and 3 other projects she'd mentioned in the panel Q&A, and he asked about all of them with the specific curiosity of someone who actually cared about the answers. They dated for 2 years. She watched how he handled professional setbacks, which were frequent in development, and almost always someone else's fault, according to Philip. She watched how he spoke about his colleagues. She watched how he spoke about his ex-wife, whom he called controlling and difficult, in a tone that Wren filed without comment. She watched how he treated the people who served him food, which was not badly, but not particularly well either. The benign inattention of someone who had never been required to notice. She chose him anyway, because she was 34. She had spent 20 years in the company of people who wanted the Forsham name. And Philip was the first person who had wanted Wren Forsham, the restoration architect with the Volvo, and the strong opinions about load-bearing walls. She told herself the rest was workable. They married quietly. Wren planned the wedding. Philip contributed opinions about the venue, and a rehearsal dinner toast that mentioned his firm 3 times. She filed that observation and got on with it. Part 3. The Mother-in-Law. Claudette Ashford was a retired event coordinator from Greenwich who had managed other people's occasions for 30 years, and retired into the full-time management of her son's life. She was elegant and precise and utterly without warmth for anyone she had not pre-selected. She wore silk in neutral tones, and spoke in the cadence of someone who had decided her perspective was the final word on every subject, and had been operating on that assumption long enough that most people around her had stopped challenging it. She visited monthly. Wren prepared for these visits with the quiet efficiency she brought to structural assessments. She knew what Claudette would find. She knew Claudette would find something, regardless, because the alternative was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was not in Claudette's repertoire, where Wren was concerned. The method was always the same: gentle, layered, delivered in the voice of helpful observation. An architect wife must keep such unusual hours, Philip. I do hope the home environment doesn't suffer. Philip needs to focus on his clients right now, Wren. You understand that, surely. What a lovely dinner. Wren, did you do this yourself? I always think it's better when people just admit they've had help. Wren's dinners were made entirely by Wren. Her hours were long because her work was precise and precision took time. The house was, if anything, over-maintained, because Wren Ashford did not allow disorder in spaces she inhabited. She said none of this. She offered more wine. The exclusions followed. A family trip to Philip's brother's graduation. Information delivered to Wren the night before. A birthday gathering for Claudette that Wren learned about from the catering receipt. Philip left on the kitchen counter. A group chat for the Ashford extended family that Wren was added to 4 months after its creation and never tagged in. When she raised these things with Philip, he gave her the same answer every time. Slightly impatient, slightly tired of the question. Mom just operates that way. You have to meet her where she is. He said this. While sitting at a table Wren had set, wearing a shirt Wren had taken to the dry cleaner, in a home that functioned entirely on the invisible infrastructure Wren had built and maintained, while Claudette sat across from him and discussed a charity luncheon. She was chairing, and did not once ask Wren a question that required a real answer. Wren absorbed it. She kept a ledger in the part of her mind that no one in that dining room could access. Claudette had an ally in Philip's younger sister, Blythe, who had her mother's gift for the kind of comment that sounds like praise and lands like a small blade. "Wren, you are just so capable," Blythe would say, as though Wren's competence were a mild personality quirk, rather than the structural foundation of every Ashford family event, dinner, holiday card, and domestic occasion that had happened in the past 3 years. An absolute rock. I honestly don't know how Philip managed before you. Wren added those words to the ledger. Part 4. The affair. She found out about the woman in the pewter dress on a Thursday. She was not looking. She was reviewing a project file on Philip's home laptop, because her own had run out of battery, and she needed a rendering she had emailed to his shared drive the week before. The browser history was not hidden. Philip did not consider the possibility that Wren would ever use his laptop, because he did not consider most things that did not directly affect him. The conversation thread was open in a tab. She read enough of it to understand the shape of the thing completely. She did not need to read more. She had been 7 weeks pregnant at that point, a fact she had told Philip about 11 days earlier, on a Tuesday evening, over dinner she had cooked. He had said, "That's great, Wren. That's really great." He had hugged her and then gone back to his phone. She closed the browser tab. She found her rendering in the shared drive. She finished her project review. She made tea. She fed her cat, a large, skeptical tabby named Pemberton, who had been living with Wren for 6 years, and had never warmed to Philip, and whom Wren had come to regard as a reasonable judge of character. She did not cry. She felt something recalibrate inside her, deep and structural, like a foundation being releveled. The test had run its full course. She spent the next 5 weeks documenting. She approached it the way she approached a structural assessment, systematically, without emotion interfering with evidence. Credit card statements showing restaurants and hotel charges on evenings when Philip had described himself as at client dinners. A contact on his phone, logged under a project name, that appeared in records more than 50 times over 8 months. A Friday afternoon when she drove to his office building and sat in the parking structure and watched him leave at 5. With a woman she recognized from the firm's website, who got into a rideshare beside him, and who was not, in any professional capacity, a reason to share a rideshare. She documented all of it, dates and locations and credit card lines, and one photograph taken from the parking structure with her phone camera at full zoom. She organized it into a secure folder, the way she organized structural deficiencies in a building assessment. Every entry dated, every detail confirmed, every piece of evidence placed in context. She did not feel angry. She felt confirmed. There is a particular clarity that comes from getting the answer you already suspected, even when the answer is the one you didn't want. She knew now, with complete certainty, what she had only theorized before. She also knew what she was going to do about it. Part 5. The Gala. The night of the firm's annual gala was supposed to be simple. Wren had organized her own attendance the way she organized everything, quietly and in advance. She had arranged for a car. She had arranged for her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Harriet, who was the only person on Wren's floor, who understood that Pemberton required his medication hidden inside a small piece of chicken and not in his water bowl, because he would not drink medicated water under any circumstances. To check on him, she had dressed carefully, in deep green silk that accommodated her 7-month belly and made her look. She knew, like a woman who had not been accommodating anyone's narrative about her limitations. She was not there to cause a scene. She was there to take the temperature of a situation she had already decided to leave, and to let Philip and Claudette have one final evening of the life they had built on her invisible labor before she withdrew the foundation. She had not anticipated Claudette's approach in the lobby. She had anticipated many things, but not the specific texture of that dismissal. So clean, so practiced, so entirely unconcerned with what it revealed about the woman delivering it. Claudette had looked at Wren's 7-month belly, and her green silk dress and her steady, quiet face, and had decided, apparently, that this was still a person who could be arranged around. That was the last miscalculation Claudette Ashford would ever make about Wren Forsham. She stood on the sidewalk for 4 minutes. She breathed. She looked at the key on the brass ring. Then she took out her phone and called a car to the private bank. Part 6. The Activation. She signed the document at 9:47 in the evening, in a private room at the bank, with 2 witnesses the bank provided and a notary who asked no questions and made no comments, because his job was to certify a signature and not to understand what it meant. What it meant was this: Wren Lacey Forsham, only child of Gordon Forsham and sole beneficiary of the Forsham Family Trust, had formally accepted the role of managing trustee, a position she had held in reserve for 3 years at her father's suggestion, pending what he had called her own timeline. She had now reached the end of that timeline. She did not go home. She drove to a property she owned through a trust entity, a brownstone on a quiet street in this historic district that she had purchased 4 years ago, before she married Philip, and had quietly restored herself over 2 long winters. It had 2 bedrooms, a south-facing study with original millwork, a kitchen with a Lacanche range she had sourced from a restaurant closure, and a guest room that she had, in recent months, converted into a nursery. The nursery had been painted 3 months ago, while Philip was at what he had described as a long client dinner. When Wren walked through the door, the lights were on a low timer. The heat was running. Pemberton was asleep in the chair by the window, because Harriet had let him in and left his dinner in the ceramic bowl that Wren had bought at a market in Portugal 4 years before meeting Philip. Wren sat beside the cat. She put her hand on his warm, dense side and felt him breathe. She called her father. Gordon Forsham answered on the first ring. He always answered on the first ring when Wren called, a practice he had maintained since the day she left for college, which he considered a reasonable minimum standard for a parent. "I signed it," Wren said. A pause. Then, "Are you safe?" "Yes." "The baby?" "The baby's fine. I need the full team. Legal and financial. By Monday morning. You'll have them by Sunday evening." She told him about the gala. She told him about Claudette. She told him about the 5 weeks of documentation. Gordon listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything. When she finished, there was a silence of the particular kind that precedes decisions that have already been made. "I'll be there by Sunday," he said. "Don't contact Philip. Don't respond to anything he sends. Route everything through counsel." "I know," she said. She knew. She sat for a long time in the chair, with her hand on the cat and the nursery down the hall and the city lights coming through the front windows, and she felt, for the first time in years, that the space around her was exactly the right size. Part 7. The Unraveling. By Monday morning, 3 things had happened. A legal team had filed for divorce on Wren's behalf, citing irreconcilable differences, and had attached to the filing a financial disclosure document that detailed, with receipts, every payment Wren had made toward the shared mortgage, the household expenses, the joint utility accounts, the homeowners association fees, and the 3 occasions on which she had transferred money from a personal account to cover shortfalls in their shared account when Philip's quarterly bonus had not arrived, on the timeline he had described. The disclosures were not unusual. What was unusual was the forensic completeness of the documentation, and the fact that Wren's legal team had filed in a jurisdiction and before a judge that the team's lead partner described as notably unsentimental about financial concealment. A forensic accountant had completed a preliminary review of Philip's finances. Philip's finances were not complicated. His salary was good. His expenses were significantly better, supported, as the documentation showed, by an invisible infrastructure he had not built and had not been asked to maintain and had never once inquired about. The mortgage on the home they shared was in both their names. The payment history was in Wren's, and the Forsham Capital Partners Real Estate Division had initiated a review of its metropolitan area portfolio. The review was routine. It identified, among other holdings, a stake in the REIT that owned the building where Philip's firm, Ashford Development, leased its primary office space. The connection was not direct. It was 4 layers deep. Wren did not own Philip's office building. She was connected, through the ordinary structure of her family's investment portfolio, to an entity that could make the building's ownership very attentive to its lease terms. She noted it. She set it aside. She was not finished deciding what she wanted to do with it. She waited to see how long it took Philip to notice she was gone. It took 9 hours. He had stayed at the gala until midnight. He came home to a house where the bedroom was exactly as he'd left it. Her side of the closet full, her car in the garage, her vitamins on the bathroom counter. But her hospital bag was gone, Pemberton was gone, and a single shelf in the study, the one that had held her mother's journals and the brass key ring and the worn copy of a structural engineering handbook her professor had given her at graduation, was empty. He called her cell. No answer. He called again. Voicemail. He sent 7 texts. They were read. They were not replied to. He called Claudette. She'll come back, Claudette said. She always comes back. She doesn't have anywhere else to go. Part 8. The panic. She did not come back. By Wednesday, Philip had received formal notification from a law firm he had never heard of, informing him that his wife had filed for divorce, and that all communication was to be routed through her legal representative. His own attorney reviewed the filing and the attached financial documentation and called Philip immediately. She has records of every payment she made, the attorney said. The mortgage, the utilities, the HOA. 3 separate account transfers. She has a forensic accountant involved. How much of the household did she actually pay for, Philip? Most of it, Philip said, after a pause that lasted longer than the answer required. And she has documentation of that. Yes. The attorney was quiet for a moment. Is there anything else I should know about? Philip thought about the pewter dress. He thought about 8 months of a contact logged in his phone under a project name. There might be, he said. The attorney's silence carried the weight of a professional who has heard this particular sentence many times and had stopped being surprised by it. The household began its collapse in the way of things that have been maintained by a system you didn't understand and can no longer access. The mortgage auto payment linked to Wren's account failed in the first week. Philip did not know the name of their mortgage servicer. He did not know the account number. He did not know what documentation would be needed to update the payment information. He spent 2 evenings on hold and accomplished approximately nothing. The utilities followed the same logic. Wren's name, Wren's autopay, Wren's organizational system, a color-coded digital file she had maintained for 3 years that Philip did not know existed, because he had never needed to know it existed, because it had never failed. It was failing now, in the specific, methodical way of infrastructure that has been maintained by a single person who has left. The cat was gone. This was not a practical problem. This was the thing Philip found himself thinking about at unexpected moments. Sitting in the dark of the kitchen, eating cereal for dinner, which was what he had been eating for the past week. Because the idea of cooking anything in the kitchen Wren had designed and maintained and stocked felt, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, impossible. Pemberton had been Wren's cat before they married. Pemberton would have left with her regardless, but he found the absence of the animal in the apartment oddly definitive. The cat had known something he hadn't. Claudette came to help. She lasted 8 days. During those 8 days, she discovered the spreadsheets, the automated payment system, the maintenance schedules for every appliance in the apartment, with model numbers and warranty information and service contacts, the insurance policies, organized by type, with renewal dates flagged, the shared household account, which showed a payment history that was, she now understood for the first time, almost entirely, Wren's. She's been running everything, Claudette said to Blythe. On the phone, in the kitchen, the evening before she went back to Greenwich. Absolutely everything. I had no idea. She was very organized, Blythe offered. She was the only competent adult in this marriage, Claudette said, and I made it my business to make her feel unwelcome in it. It was the most honest sentence Claudette Ashford had said about her daughter-in-law since the day they met. It arrived approximately 3 years too late to change anything. Part 9. The withdrawal. The woman in the pewter dress, whose name was Sasha, and who worked in business development, had been drawn to Philip Ashford for reasons that made sense when you did not look at them carefully. He had seemed, to Sasha, like a man who had his life in order. The apartment was beautiful. The dinners he described were elegant. He wore good shirts and was never late, and had a confidence she had initially mistaken for capability. She had looked at his life and seen a man who operated at a high level. She had been looking at Wren's architecture. The shirts were laundered and pressed on Wren's schedule. The dinners had been cooked in Wren's kitchen. The apartment had been maintained by Wren's systems. The social credibility Philip had carried into every professional room for 3 years had been built on a foundation he had never once been required to inspect. Stripped of that foundation, Philip was a man who ate cereal for dinner and couldn't find the building super's number, and had sent 17 unanswered texts to his estranged wife, because the alternative, which was to sit with the fact that he had treated an exceptional person as a convenience and lost her as a consequence, was a thing he was not yet equipped to do. Sasha did the math in 6 weeks. The math did not favor continued involvement. She sent a brief professional text. She blocked his number. She moved on with a briskness that Philip would later describe to his therapist, who he started seeing in month 4, as brutal, though his therapist would gently note that it seemed more like clarity. Philip sat in the apartment on a Tuesday night and felt, for the first time in his adult life, the specific, groundless vertigo of a man who has discovered that he was never the architect of his own circumstances. He was an occupant. He had lived in a building someone else had designed and someone else had maintained, and that someone had now quietly, methodically, permanently left. And the structure was not going to survive her absence because it was never designed to. Part 10. The Reveal. 4 months after the gala, Ren's baby was born, a daughter. 6 pounds, 14 ounces. She came into the world on a Wednesday morning in February, with a seriousness about her that the delivery nurse described as remarkable, which Ren privately attributed to the child having had 7 months to observe her mother's decision-making process from the inside. She named her Frances Gordon Forsham Wren. She would carry both names until she was old enough to decide what she wanted to do with them. Gordon arrived the following morning with flowers and a stroller he had researched for 3 months, and a general air of a man who had been waiting patiently for this specific Tuesday for a very long time. He sat beside the hospital bed and held his granddaughter with the careful, slightly odd steadiness of a person who builds things and is newly in the presence of a thing that cannot be built, only received. The Forsham Capital real estate team, meanwhile, had completed its portfolio review. The building housing Ashford development had, as anticipated, received notice of a market-rate lease adjustment. The notice was not aggressive. It was precise. The new terms reflected current rates, with no concession for the prior relationship, which had been managed, at a below-market rate, through an intermediary arrangement that was now being restructured. Philip's firm could not absorb the adjustment without cutting staff. Philip had not known, until the review surfaced it, that the favorable lease had anything to do with his wife. He still did not know. He simply knew that the building had become expensive, and that several other comfortable things had also, in recent months, become expensive, in a way that seemed to have no single cause and every possible effect. Part 11. The Preservation Hearing. The Historic Preservation Board's public hearing for the Emerson Street Corridor project was held on a Thursday afternoon in March. It was the kind of meeting that drew architects and developers and community advocates, and 3 or 4 journalists from the local press who covered urban planning and appreciated the committee's refreshments. Philip was there representing a development consortium that had been pursuing the site for 18 months. It was a significant project, possibly the largest of his career. His presentation was polished. His renderings were well produced. He had spoken for 12 minutes and taken 4 questions when the board chair indicated that the evening's final presentation would be given by the representative of the Forsham Preservation Initiative, a newly established entity that had filed as an interested party 2 months prior. Ren walked in through the side door. She was not wearing the green silk. She was wearing what she wore to work, which was a well-cut linen blazer, and the kind of flat-soled boots that indicated a person who stood on construction sites and did not find them inconvenient. Frances was 4 weeks old and home with Gordon and a night nurse. Pemberton was on the couch in the brownstone study. She placed her presentation materials at the podium. She did not look at Philip. She acknowledged the board chair and the seated members, and 2 architects she knew from prior projects, and 1 city council member she had worked with on an adaptive reuse initiative 2 years earlier. She spoke for 8 minutes. She spoke about the Emerson Street buildings, about the original construction dates, and the structural conditions documented in assessments her firm had completed over the past 3 months, about the embedded carbon in the existing structures and the environmental cost of demolition versus restoration, about the community businesses that occupied 4 of the 7 buildings on the corridor, and the displacement projections if the site were cleared for new development. She did not speak about Philip. She did not need to. 3 members of the board knew the Ashford name. They knew the dissolution. They knew, from the public filing, the financial shape of the marriage. Ren did not reference any of it. She presented her case on its merits, because her case was strong on its merits, and because she had never needed anything else. The board voted 4-2 to table Philip's consortium's proposal, pending an independent structural assessment. The assessment would be conducted by a firm to be selected by the board. Ren thanked the board. She collected her materials. She walked out through the side door. Philip sat in the second row and watched her leave, and felt the floor of the room shift in a way that had nothing to do with the building's foundation and everything to do with his own. A colleague leaned over and said, quietly, "Did you know she was involved in this project?" "No," Philip said. He had not known. He had been married to Rin for 3 years, and he had not known what she was working on, what she cared about, what mattered to her, because he had never once asked a question about her life that required a real answer. He had known she was an architect. He had known she was organized. He had known she managed the household. He had not known her. He understood this now. He understood it in the specific, irrevocable way that comes from watching someone you dismissed walk into a room and rearrange it without raising her voice. Part 12. What remained? The divorce was finalized in early summer. The terms were agreed upon without litigation, which was not because Philip was generous, but because Rin's documentation was thorough and her legal team was patient. And the cost of contesting her financial disclosures was, his attorney informed him, unlikely to produce a better outcome. Claudette sent a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, on monogrammed stationery. It contained the word sorry 4 times. It contained several paragraphs about family and legacy and the expectations she had been raised to hold. It did not contain a single specific sentence about a single specific thing she had done. It was, Ren recognized, the kind of apology written entirely for the benefit of the person writing it. She read it once. She placed it in a folder. She would decide later whether to respond. Blythe sent a text. It said, "Hi, Ren. I know things have been difficult. I was wondering if you'd be interested in reviewing the Forsham Initiative's grant criteria. I have a project that might be a good fit." Ren read it. She set her phone down. She thought about the words "an absolute rock," delivered in the voice of a woman who had never once treated her as a person rather than a function. Blythe could find the application on the website. That was what the website was for. Philip called once. Ren's attorney relayed the message. He wanted to know, the attorney said, if there was a possibility of some kind of conversation. He had been in therapy. He understood. He wanted her to know that he had not appreciated what she was. He was working on it. Ren was in the brownstones' back garden when she heard this. June light came through the fence slats in long lines across the flagstone patio she had relaid herself 2 summers ago. Frances was asleep in the pram beside her chair. Pemberton was on the flagstone, positioned in a specific patch of sun, with the precision of an animal who has long since solved the problem of comfort. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the light. "Tell him I wish him well," she said to the attorney, "and tell him that understanding what you lost and being capable of something different are not the same thing. He should take his time figuring out which one applies." She hung up. She looked at her daughter again. Frances was asleep with one hand curled near her face, the other resting flat on the pram's white cotton. She was 4 months old, and already deeply opinionated about the temperature of her formula and the specific rhythm required for sleep, and Ren regarded these opinions as entirely reasonable. Her mother's gold band was on Ren's right hand. The word "remain" was engraved on the inside. Ren had spent years believing it was an instruction about marriage, about persisting through difficulty, about staying. She understood now that it was something else. It was an instruction about self. Remain yourself, through all of it, through the accommodation and the erasure and the slow, patient effort to make yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of a wife. Remain. Come back to yourself. No matter how long it takes or what it costs, she had remained, and then she had rebuilt. Part 13. The morning. On a Saturday in September, 10 months after the night of the gala, Ren sat in the back garden of the brownstone, with a cup of coffee and her daughter on her lap. Gordon Forsham sat across from her in a wicker chair, eating toast that he had made himself in the kitchen Ren had designed, because Gordon had always maintained that a person who cannot make their own breakfast is a person who has misunderstood what breakfast is for. Pemberton was asleep on the flagstone in the morning sun. Frances was awake, examining the light the way she examined everything, with total, unhurried focus. The Emerson Street Corridor project had broken ground the previous week. Ren's preservation proposal had been adopted in modified form. 3 of the 7 buildings would be retained and restored, the others redeveloped in a design that incorporated the corridor's original material palette. It was not a complete victory. It was an honest outcome which was, in Ren's experience, generally better. Ashford Development had merged with a smaller firm and relocated to less expensive offices. Philip was still practicing. He had, from what Ren could observe from the distance of public filings and professional directories, made some adjustments. She wished him nothing particular. She also did not think about him very much. Gordon watched his daughter from across the table. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said only, "Your mother would have liked her very much." Wren looked at Frances. "Yes," she said, "she would have." She lifted her daughter up against her shoulder and felt the specific solid warmth of a small person who is entirely without pretense, and entirely dependent, and entirely worth every single thing. The gold band caught the morning light on Wren's right hand. The word remained pressed gently against her skin. She looked at the building around her. The cornices she had repaired, with a mason she'd found through a preservation forum. The sash windows she had reglazed herself over 2 January weekends. The garden wall she had repointed by hand because the original mortar mix mattered to her, and she was the only person who was going to insist on it. She had built all of it. She had built it quietly, methodically, without asking anyone for permission or recognition or applause. She had built it while people called her accommodating, and then controlling, and then, in their final reckoning, essential. She had built it, and she had walked away from the people who could not see it and into the life that had been hers all along, waiting patiently, like good bones in an old building, for someone willing to look. If you heard something in this story that you've been carrying a long time, we made it for you. Subscribe and stay close. What comes next is already being built.